Yeah, no, I've been thinking about this one for a couple days, man, and it's well, actually longer than that. And the question I've kind of been dealing with privately for a bit is a sort of gotcha situation that people find themselves in with leftists as it relates to the Second Amendment quite often, and that's like how far do you take the Second Amendment, and whether or not like civilians should be able to own tanks and missiles and nukes and all those different kinds of things. And so Scalise and I were discussing it a little bit before we started, and one of the things that's very interesting about the Second Amendment that people on both the right and the left tend to shy away from, and that's the fact that one of the biggest reasons for it was to protect, so that the people could protect themselves from the rise of a tyrannical government. And so at that point in time, the people, they owned muskets because that was where the tech was at. And that was the military grade weapons of its time. And one of the things that Scalise and I kind of ran into and agreed with, really quickly when we were discussing it before, is the fact that if you're going to contextualize the Second Amendment in modern days, and the intent then was for the people to have the ability to protect themselves against a tyrannical government, then the contextualized version of the Second Amendment now would require that the people present have the necessary technology to make them a threat to the government now. So, Scalise.
Yeah, this is one of those very interesting areas where studying rhetoric and then really, I guess, the nature of interpretation and linguistic theory and so forth really comes into play. Actually, it's many of you are affected by it, whether you know it or not. The Supreme Court justices, for instance, depending on whether they're conservatives or liberal, take very different what are called literary theories in how they handle the context of the Constitution. So the liberals say it's a living document, and therefore you have to recontextualize it, use our context and our meaning of words to understand the Constitution today, right? So they move the historical framework up to present day along with those grammatical meanings. Whereas something like conservative, and this goes for biblical interpretation as well, you're trying to find out the intended use of the words in that historical context when it was written, in the grammar, and within the domains of meaning that existed then. And so what we were discussing pre-show was that the Second Amendment comes after, very carefully and importantly, the preamble of the Constitution. Anyone who knows the preamble knows that the preamble exists precisely to describe government tyranny, and that the society or the civilians have the right and obligation to throw off a government tyranny. So when you say, well, the Second Amendment's about protecting your household from thieves or what have you, it is indeed about that, but that would be not to pay attention to the historical context. Those amendments were born
Yeah.
out of a freedom fighter movement called the Revolutionary War against a utterly tyrannical King George government. If you go on and you read all the usurpations that the preamble lists, you'll see that many of the situations that we would consider utterly breaking of human rights, massive human rights violations, were occurring then by the British Empire. So this is not, so whenever we look at that, then you say, well, the Second Amendment is about what exactly? Well, it's in the context of throwing off the tyranny of a government, and therefore the people of that time had to have the commensurate weapons and even treaties, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people forget about the French. French played an instrumental role in the Revolutionary War. And so, not just about, it's not merely just about having commensurate weapons, but it could also be about having commensurate relationships to stave off a tyrannical
Yeah.
government.
Yeah. And I suppose the question would be like, depending on the complexity of the weapons or treaties you're talking about, like what kind of organization should you have wrapped around that to make it so it's something stable or safe? I mean, obviously that's something that has to be debated, and I think was even within view when the Second Amendment involved the idea of well organized militias.
Well, and let me speak
Um,
second. It says well-regulated militia, and again, this
well
this
regulated.
this comes
Yeah,
down to
yeah,
again contextualization. So if you look at the word well-regulated as what it means today, obviously the politicians are going to try to capitalize on that and say therefore it should be
yeah,
regulated. But you just want to be like, duh. Clearly, it can't mean that because the entire point of the Second Amendment, following on the heels of the preamble, is to say that you'll be throwing off the tyranny involved in the regulation. So it can't. So it just when you kind of like
yeah.
look at that, you just go, well, duh, it couldn't mean that. But importantly, if you go back and look at what that word meant, well regulated meant something like well trained at that time. So
Yep.
it meant about being familiar with the weapons you're using and being trained on it. Not it didn't mean that the government need to regulate it because again, that's stupidity. Like that would defeat the point.
Which interestingly, which interestingly enough, good training, depending on what you're talking about, let's say firearms and then do on one extreme and then nukes on the other. So training, if you're going to have proper training, would require certain levels of facilities, you name it. And knowledge and all kinds of infrastructure wrapped around that to make it something proper. I mean, it might even be that if we had gone down this route of actually having citizens armed in a commensurate fashion, that nukes may have never never
existed.
been
Well,
invented.
yeah, I mean
Yeah,
the Manhattan
yeah.
Project. I mean that isn't a unwarranted argument. Of course, World War II still would have happened, so the probability seemed
Yeah.
like it still would have occurred. But yeah, if you are fearful of
It
the
is.
citizenry, who is it? Is it Thomas Jefferson that said tyranny reigns when the citizens are fearful of their government? It says freedom reigns when the
Yeah.
government is fearful of their citizens. I think that was Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, and if we were armed in the same fashion, or at least a way that caused them serious pause, and that's like, remember, Joe Biden just recently came out and scoffed, which makes me wonder at the same time why they're so ardent on going after just firearms, like basically going after the firearms that citizens have, because was it 2 months ago he came out and in a press conference was kind of like laughing about firearm owners and is just like, in order to go against us, you would have to have F-16s and missiles.
Yeah, that's exactly
stuff like
right.
that.
Yeah, he came out and said, well, you got guns, but you're going to be able to fight an F-35, and then went on to discuss something about the
F-16.
F-16, the tree of patriotism.
Yeah, no. F-16s are the older one.
Yeah, I think
I'm
it's
sorry.
F-35.
Continue.
But that the tree of liberty is watered with the blood, and he was just kind of making fun of it. But now, Aaron, I think that the multiplicity of guns in our country and the multiplicity of ammo does rise to the level of nearly a commensurate resistance to the government, apart from something like a full-scale actual kinetic war using all the military against the actual civilian population, which is almost like mutually assured destruction, because if you destroyed your civilization or civilians, then you no longer have the economy, right? So you become a pariah on the world.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Probably that's the reason why they're so adamant about it, because the amount is at a level that keeps them from being able to do anything on the ground type tyranny that is incremental and progressive, right?
Yeah.
You can't really do that type of stuff when you got guns everywhere.
Well, I think the thing that I'm most worried about right now is the lack of attention being put on securing ammo supplies, and that's one thing they've been taking advantage of for a while. Is just basically hurting the ability to manufacture or diverting most of the supply to the government. Essentially like artificially limiting what's on the shelves. Available to the citizens, and that's kind of, it's pretty worrisome.
Well, that's entirely true.
So there's
my father called me from Pennsylvania, and I don't know if it's going to change now. That looks like Governor Wolf is going to be out. Hopefully, they get the nominee there, Mastriano. But I mean, my dad. Now it's changed a little bit in the past 8 months or so. So they're able to get ammo. But even when I went up there to visit him and we were looking for ammo, it was still very slim. But there was a time there in 2020 the better part of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, my dad said you couldn't get any ammo, like almost nothing.
Yeah.
And now that wasn't the case in Florida, right? I was able to go buy ammo the whole time, no problem, of all types. It got expensive in 2020, in the beginning of 2021, but it's cooled off since then.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I guess as it's possible we can even make this a short, but like coming back to the original idea, I kind of want to state it outright, and it's something that I've kind of waxed and waned on because most conservatives just focus on the weapons, and I would dare say would not agree that the citizens should have their hands on fully military level weapons, and that's firearms to missiles, you name it. But at this moment in time, considering where our government's going, actually, no, scrap that. If we're going to stay true to the idea of the Second Amendment, then yes, the citizens have to have their hands on the type of weapons that would be a threat to their government. And what that would look like right now, I'm not entirely sure because I have never served in the armed forces. I'm not sure exactly what all exists out there right now, but I do know idea wise that yeah, staying true to it, I would have to say that the citizens need their hands on far more than what is legal presently, because our government doesn't fear us. They shouldn't actually.
Well, there is
Um,
there's two. What you're talking about is the quality of the weapon, right? The nature of the weapon
mm-hmm.
itself, and I think
Not
that's
just
one part of.
well, and the
Well,
type.
well, that's what I mean. Quality type is fine, but
Yeah,
I'm just putting that into the domain of quality. Whereas right now, what we have is quantity, right? So I think there's two
yeah,
sides of that coin, and both sides are important because, yeah, you could
yeah.
have a civilian population that has access to very high types and quality of weapons, but there weren't many of them. It wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
matter. So you actually have to have both sides. So
No.
we do have the quantity. I think that's a big checkbox there, which is a good thing. It's one of the reasons why they're very fearful of doing any sort of mass tyranny on the ground in any place that the Democrats don't have a deadlock on.
Yeah, I find it so interesting that a lot of lefties try to use the whole, well, they had muskets at that time, yada yada, and completely forget the fact that that was the military grade tech at that
Well, yeah,
moment.
that's what I mean. You ever watch the
So
movie The Patriot? I mean, not to
yeah,
say that we should be using that for historical guidance necessarily, but the point is that yeah, they're using the same way. They got cannons just like they have cannons. They've got muskets just like the redcoats have muskets. I mean, it's symmetrical warfare. That's what's happening there. If anything, what
yeah,
they need, what the one thing at least from that movie that the Brits had that the U.S. didn't was a really well uh, trained cavalry. Right, that was kind of
yeah,
the real interesting part about that movie was the cavalry with swords, right? Even though there's guns were the prominent thing, this cavalry with swords and hand pistols were the big game changer.
yeah. So I know it's an uncomfortable one. It's been an uncomfortable conversation for me for a while, and it's one up until a couple weeks ago that I think I may have just been like, okay, maybe we can't go that far, but considering what's historically true about governments, I mean, if you want to talk about mass murders, governments are by far the worst offenders of, taking human life on this planet. And I know what some of our citizens have done is horrible, but it comes nowhere close to the bloodshed that governments have caused. And to that end, they need to be kept in check, and I don't know any other way but to take the Second Amendment at its face value and say that yes, indeed, that means we as citizens should be armed with far better weapons. And again, how that looks, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, we haven't entertained that idea for a long time. We've entertained the firearm, kind of protecting the gun side, but it's quite clear that weapons have gone much further than what they were 200 years ago.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean it's a very
it's
fearful thing. You saw the Don
It is.
Bongino show where they were discussing the military grade drones that the Chinese are rolling out.
Yeah.
They basically fly like a pack
Yep.
of hornets almost. I mean, they're bigger than hornets, but they fly like in a pack through the woods. Really amazing that they don't run into anything. And I don't know if they have little weapons
Yeah.
attached to them. Obviously, you got the whole drone warfare thing is insanely scary because now you're talking about a tyranny that's enactable without actually costing any blood on the other end of the person holding the switches. So that's not real good. You want attrition. You want attrition when somebody goes to war with you. You don't want to be
Yeah.
them able to deploy all sorts of massive armaments against you, and it costs them nothing in terms of manpower.
And what was the phrase that Chuck Schumer said about the intelligence agencies in regards to Trump at that time? He
They
was
have
like,
6 ways.
he was like, you don't want to mess
Yeah,
with
they have
them.
6 ways
Yeah.
to destroy you, I think, is what he said.
Yeah, like six. Was it that? I think he used that phrase 6 ways to Sunday, or I don't know, something like that, to say that there is just like innumerable ways for the intelligence agencies to get to him and destroy him, and that's something that was aimed at all of us. That's exactly what Chuck Schumer meant. He was talking about Trump, but I mean that reality is true for us all, and if that's the case, I mean. I kind of think there should be the same kind of thought going back the other direction if they want to get that kind. If people like Chuck Schumer want to entertain that kind of idea of tyranny, because he was not referring to the normal legal route, he was referring to something extra there, and it's kind of like no, if you wanna go there, bro, the citizen should have some ways to make you fear taking those kinds of actions. Is my personal
Schumer
thought.
said in January of 2017, he warned Trump that the intel officials have 6 ways from Sundays at getting back at you. So yeah, I mean that's what they said, and Trump has repeatedly said that they really want you. I'm just in the way. And by and large, I believe Trump on that end, and I'm grateful for him. I love those memes of him, taking all these arrows or what have you on our behalf, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I just was going through old feed, and there's just some really weird questions about that guy because he had it all. It's just really strange that he's endangered himself and his quality of life, and even his freedom and his kids' freedoms. When you're a billionaire with fame and power, and was loved before all this, was really loved by the mainstream press. If you look at the way that I don't know, it's very odd that he did this to himself. It's a very strange thing.
Well, and the thing about Chuck Schumer's statement is it's true. The intelligence agencies do
and they
have.
did. I mean, 51 intelligence agents lied about the Hunter Biden laptop in October, and to our knowledge, not one thing has been done about them. Not one of them has been removed. Which of course,
and planted evidence.
Planted evidence, yeah.
I mean, they committed sedition against him.
That's what Barr says. William Barr said, and that's a big deal for that guy. Because he's really careful.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
He came out and said Hillary Clinton
is
guilty of sedition.
Yeah, so I mean, granted, it wasn't. I guess we didn't see any assassinations happen of even any of Trump's like staff or anything like that. Although the Clintons definitely have kind of an interesting history with people dropping around them that cross them.
Hillary,
but
hashtag
I mean,
Hillary.
yeah, but I mean, I guess the same thing applies though. Like, it's not necessarily that the intelligence agencies will do something completely violent. It's just they can do any number of illegal activity that completely destroy your life also. And there needs to be mechanisms to keep that kind of thing in check. And unfortunately, they don't have the proper fear. And the reason for that is the citizen isn't empowered in the way that they should, and that's both legally and in the form of
and
weapons.
and
So
and
both of those have
conviction
been
and
hit.
worldview. I mean, our even our
True.
conservative movement is
Yeah.
majorly neutered just due to their lack of really, I think, strong worldview foundation and convictions. Hard to follow through with anything that costs you a great deal when you yourself are just a person of let's call it fuzzy or weak convictions with a fuzzy worldview, right? Like, yeah.
And and what we're talking about today is an example of that. This is, I mean, and granted, you may have heard somebody say the same thing, but this is the first time that I've actually heard somebody go ahead and claim this. Not trying to pat myself or us on the back necessarily, but yeah, no, I mean, I haven't seen the right take this stance, and it seems to me, if you're considering the context, that the Second Amendment would have to be interpreted this way, and they don't. So this is another,
Yeah,
it's
the
another one
rights.
of those examples
Oh,
where
go
we.
ahead.
Sorry, no,
So
no,
the
go
right,
for it.
yeah, the right's just fearful of probably character suicide, maybe even some measure of political
Yeah,
suicide if they were to advocate for any of these type of topics, just because it sets you up as an easy target. There's got to be a way to discuss it. For instance, like we did. Like, why don't you just come at it at a historical perspective? I mean, it's not a hard argument. You just say, well, the preamble existed,
they don't.
and the amendments follow from the preamble, and they just got done throwing off government tyranny with commensurate weapons against government, against this tyrannizing government. I mean, it's a pretty easy argument,
Yep.
and I think, at least from a historical argument
No.
perspective, I don't think that's very difficult. Now, when you start, when you
No.
get nervous, though, right, is when you start saying, well, what type of weapons would your common man have
Yep.
to have access to for it to really become commensurate? And that's where everyone's like, that'll be political suicide if I go out there and say that.
Well, I mean, the answer, if you're going to be if you're going to be honest about it, is you would have to have an equal force. And I'm not sure what that looks like. And of course, people always jump to the nuclear side, as kind of that like gotcha thing where it's just like, oh, you're shut down. But,
Yeah, I don't even think you go there.
part of me is just,
Nukes actually are just assured mass destruction. I'm not sure that
yeah,
that isn't.
would even
Yeah,
be necessary. Yeah.
that's kind of, and that's an easy way to shut down the conversation, though, which is why people go there, right? To shut
Yep.
it down.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the conversation would be, okay, Joe, you mentioned it, F-35s or whatever F plane you were referring to. Again, not an expert in this stuff. I probably won't be one of the pilots if this were to be enacted. But
That's funny. By the way,
It's-
since we're running low on time, I did want to just mention: was anyone else? I was a little. Here's this is going to sound funny, but I was a little disappointed with Joe Biden's speech last night. I thought it was going to be something a lot more, I don't know, audacious than what it was. Now I understand Tucker Carlson packed it really well. Basically, if he was able to get a ban on the type of magazines that he was referring to, then that would effectively be banning 90% of weapons, because most weapons aren't made but with magazines that are in excess of 10 rounds or more, even handguns. So
Yep.
I understand that it's kind of like a subtle roundabout way of trying to disarm the populace, but I thought it was going to be something like Trudeau style.
Well, so there's been a limit in that kind of like a magazine limit on shotguns, for, well, at least on the hunting end, which is kind of odd. Like there's been these like things in hunting shotguns, plugs essentially, that limit the amount of rounds that you can put in the mags. But that should be taken away. By the way, that really doesn't make much.
Well, you
much
don't have
sense.
to. I bought that semi-automatic shotgun that it doesn't have. It's
Yeah,
got a
has
massive
more.
clip, that thing's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a tactical one too that has a elongated. Actually, I think the plug only is only needed when hunting for some reason, which I just, again, that's I'm sure there's some kind of logic behind it, but it's stupid. Anyway, that may have been done away with, but my only reason for bringing that up is the way you could possibly get around it is putting limiters in magazines, and that wouldn't, that would, some kind of way to limit the amount of rounds that's in the magazines that are already out there. But I would never let that happen. I would never. Oh, the citizen right now should not be coming close to entertaining anything else that limits their access to
Well,
firearms
I don't think any
legally
of the citizens are. It doesn't
at all.
matter how many mass shootings they put. Most citizens aren't on board with the logic that X person does something wrong, therefore Y population has to pay the price. Most of us aren't cool with those
Yeah,
type of ethics. I know that's BLM Antifa ethics, right? Where you basically, the perpetrator doesn't get blamed, but everyone around the perpetrators that whatever created a systemic context of oppression or whatever, some vague, opaque, broad thing that you can say exists without being able to really like demonstrate it. But I don't think most people that are into the Second Amendment aren't entertaining any of this. It's the congressman, the
yeah.
Republican congressman, we really have to worry about, because I saw Lindsey Graham out there, and that guy is such a I detest that man. I mean, come on, he put out this, oh, we're
And
welcome to whatever your ideas you put forward, Joe. We're all listening. And of course they all
yeah,
sell it
no,
on the blood of the children, and it's disgusting. Like, oh, you guys don't care
yeah,
about
no,
children.
it's
You want abortions still after birth. I mean, shut up. Y'all don't care about children. Get out of here.
well, and honestly, like the conversation needs further, better framing too, and that's one thing that I started doing in yesterday's podcast, and that was I didn't call it an anti-gun movement. I called it the anti-Second Amendment movement. When it came to, when we were talking about Operation Fast and Furious and what they were using the optics of that operation for was to, go against the Second Amendment. And a lot of times, I think we improperly frame it as a anti-gun movement. It's not at all an anti-gun movement. It's an anti-Second Amendment movement. The left, the politicians on the left have no problem with guns at all. They're completely fine with the government having them. And it is completely focused on disarming the citizens. There might be some idiots on the ground, various citizens who actually believe there shouldn't be weapons, but I even have a hard time believing they actually think that way, seeing how whenever they're in trouble, they very often call 911, hoping that those guys come to protect them with guns. So honestly, I think that framework is complete bullshit from A to B. It's not an anti-gun movement. It's who they believe should have access to them, and it's clearly on their side one that is solely focused on the government having the right. And historically, really bad idea if you're against mass slaughter.
Yeah, so like you said, you could call it a advancing despotism. Is really what's happening there,
Yeah,
right? So it's disarm
yeah,
the populace. It's like selectively allowing government and their operatives to have weapons, which is really just advancing despotism. That's what we could call the movement if you were
yeah,
going to summarize it.
yeah. Well, the nature of power, right? It doesn't want to be checked, and a public that is armed to the point that it can actually cause the government to fear the people it is over. And in our case, shouldn't actually be over in the sense that most of the world believes, looks at the word over. But yeah, I mean, they're not going to like that. It's an uncomfortable thing, and it should be.
I want
Being a government official should not be something that's so cushy.
Yeah. I
So,
want to address one semantic or contextual item here at the end, and just because Joe Biden last night did say the Second Amendment is not absolute. So I just want to point out again, going back to the preamble of the Constitution and then the rights that are delineated from that, understand that the Constitution says that men are created in the image of their Creator and have an inalienable rights, which would make them absolute by the sheer existence of your person. So life, liberty, and happiness, and then all the other, the Bill of Rights is really like an expansion of what that means into the very
yeah.
specific domains of protections and rights. So I just want to point this out when because you hear this refrain occurring a lot these days, that the Second Amendment is not absolute, but if you're following the actual grammar and logic of the Constitution, it would be God has the authority. God invested that authority, rights, freedom, etc., into humanity. and thereby uh, it is inalienable, using the preamble's own language there, from that person so long as
Yep.
you exist. And in which case it is absolute. Because if it can't be separated from you, right, the government doesn't bestow rights on you in America. It's not a privilege they're giving you. It's something that God has given you. And then we bestow our authority to the government to represent us and to protect us, right?
Yes.
And obviously that's entirely truncated at this point. But I just wanted to point that out. Another very important contextual framing there.
Yeah, it's very important, and if there are people out there, constitutional experts, non-experts, you name it. If you disagree with this point of view, visit the comments section. Tell us what you think. Tell us whether you think this is completely harebrained. I mean, I've spent years thinking about this one and have finally just realized that I was not being, I personally was not being honest in the conversation. I let the gotcha side clam me up on this one, and the answer for me was staring me right in the face, and that is that yes, if the government is the intended object to be, if the government should be in fear of the citizen, then there is a domino effect, meaning there needs to be a reason that they are afraid, and the only way you can have that is if you have equal force or more, depending on what, at least equal. If you disagree, I said,
and it was Thomas Jefferson that said, and I'll quote it exactly here: "When government fears the people, there is liberty. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny."
Yeah, well, thank you again. And Scalise, thank you. And guys, cheers.